So welcome to the sixth session of our Amplify Voices of the Global Majority series, which has been focusing on food and environmental justice. And my name is Miles Newton, and I'm your co-host along with my colleague Jessica Duravaj for this journey throughout this week. And today we get to welcome Rowen White, who will be giving us a presentation on reseeding imaginations of a relational agricultural system. And as we have been doing through this week and previously, we've been joining forces with change makers from around the globe who are working to dismantle inequity and mitigate harm while stewarding the planet and prioritizing collective wellness for us all, as well as stressing interdependent liberation. And throughout history, voices of the global majority, Black, Indigenous, people of color, have been at the forefront of breaking down barriers of systemic issues that are affecting both the planet and us as human society, while ushering in radical change. And whether that's been at the forefront of fighting injustice on the lines of our society or bringing yoga to the West, this has been a time that has required us to listen and to heal historical wounds while doing things differently than we have been. And so we continue to enter into this work as an act of community care for us all, because none of us can be well unless all of us are well. And so again, we welcome you in this work, and we're inspired to continue sharing this space with you along the way. And so we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're very honored to be gathering here virtually, located in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts on the unceded territory of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans. And on behalf of Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, we invite you to share with us in the chat the land that you are joining from and the indigenous inhabitants that have stewarded those lands. And we'll take a moment for you to just type that right into the chat where you're joining from. And today we've been stewarding the lands that we're coming from as a nonprofit educational organization that's been dedicated to empowering people and communities to realize their full potential through the transformative wisdom and practice of yoga. And this Amplify Voices series has been made possible because of the generous gifts of our donors. And so we thank them and we thank you for your presence here with us today. And as part of the collective space, we're also sharing some agreements. So these are our online community agreements. So we are posting them in the chat. So take a moment to read them over. And by staying with us here in the space, and you're acknowledging and opting into those, and we thank you for doing so. So just before we kind of dive into this wonderful presentation, let's take a moment to settle in. So if you'll just kind of relax into whatever is holding you, either the ground or your seat, and take a nice gentle inhale through the nose and let it out through the mouth. And take another breath in through the nose, and let it out through the mouth. And then one more as we land and come together. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Miles, and welcome everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our facilitator for this session, Rowen White. Rowen White is a seed keeper, farmer, and author from the Mohawk community of Akwesasne, and a passionate activist for Indigenous seed and food sovereignty. She is the educational director and lead mentor of Sierra Seeds, an innovative Indigenous seed bank and land-based educational organization located in Nevada City, California. Rowen is the founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which is committed to restoring the Indigenous seed commons and currently serves as a cooperative seed hub coordinator. She facilitates creative hands-on workshops and strategic conversations in community around seed, food security, around food security around the country within tribal and small farming communities. She weaves stories of seeds, food culture, and sacred earth stewardship on her blog, Seed Songs, and other distinguished publications. Miles and I are here to support your needs in any way. You can DM us over in the chat, or feel free to email onlinesupport@kripalu.org if you're having, if you need to give any feedback or if you need any support. Towards the end of the program, there'll be an opportunity to engage with Rowen and ask questions. So without further ado, I know we are all here to hear Ms. Rowen White, so we are so excited. Welcome, Rowen.
Oh, It's a pleasure to be here. Sego, Sewaguego, Ganyat Daho Yingyats. I just introduced myself in my ancestral language, which is Ganyat Geha. And I come from like Jessica said, I come from a very small community right on the New York Canadian border called Akwesasne. My family has lived there for many, many, many generations, and I come from the Snipe clan. So those are who hold me accountable in my work, and who my work really rests upon their shoulders. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I want to bring in some of the beauty and imagery from the work that we do here at Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, as well as Sierra Seeds. But I also wanted to take an opportunity, just as Miles had done, to really just drop in, so an opportunity for us to land from wherever we're coming in from. And I, in addition to being a seed keeper and a mother and a community activist and all of these things, I'm also a storyteller and a writer. So I brought in a couple of short poems that I just kind of wanted to bring in to just sort of build the space, decorate the space and bring us all into, as Haudenosaunee people, we talk about bringing ourselves into good heart and good mind. So the first one is a piece called An Expression of Faith, which I actually wrote in March 2020, right as we were entering into the global pandemic. So feel free to just get comfortable wherever you are, whether you're sitting down or standing, and just, touch a piece of the good earth underneath you. An expression of faith in life herself is to sow seeds into dark soil, not knowing what awaits. Returning to the patience, reverence, grace, humility, practiced by our ancestors, who knew how to feed the hungers of time that call down the rains with a simple song. It is those kind of people whose memory courses through my vein like wild rivers, reminding us to wake up amidst the confusion, to do what must be done to feed the children, to tuck vibrant seeds into fertile soil and patiently tend the garden, our backs bent in service. To those whose faces look up at us from the well-worn path that we walk. The garden that our ancestors left for us is so beautiful. May we water it well with our tears and our laughter, our stories and our songs. Today, I choose to plant seeds of hope into the winds of an unknown future. May we grow from this tiny seed of remembrance, this intimate immensity, coming totally apart, emerging out of the hard shell of generations of protection and prayer, a seed coat tempered by love and loss, joy and pain, coming completely undone to reorient to this new form. It's a new day and it's a new dawn. The time to be those ancestors that our grandchildren are waiting for is upon us. And I have one question for you. What seeds are you sowing? So just let the seeds of those words drop into your body and just lean into that reverent curiosity of what that is rehydrating for you. And I'll just drop into one other short piece, and then we'll go into a good time of storytelling and sharing from the work and the movement that I am here representing. So this one is called They Tried to Bury Us. As someone once said, they tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. This conjures up generations of people who came before me, who in their own ways prayed for the sprouting of our deeply connected lifeways again. I return with my children in hand to the traditional earth-based ways of our people, the first in many bloodlines, to follow the sacred ceremonial calendar, renewing time-honored relationships with the grand family all around us, eating our traditional foods and caring for their seeds. Those ancestors, they prayed for us in many ways, in foreign tongues and in small everyday ceremonies of patting babies to sleep and stirring the cooking pot and sitting in the shade tree of an oak to make a basket and rowing such baskets across mighty rivers to market, in the songs that honored the births and the deaths, the plantings and the harvests. These prayers of our ancestors, in their own special ways, sowed seeds of resilience and vitality that they knew would take a few generations of laying dormant in the dark soil of our hearts, carried down through our blood memory in the rivers of our mother's sweet womb water that is held in our spines, in our veins, and in our marrow. 7 generations or more, these seeds of prayers were tucked into the safety of the soil of underground mycelia of cultural and ancestral memory, tucked into the earth that is our own bodies, connected through those tributaries of bloodlines. These seeds are finally sprouting in their own time. The seeds enduring scarification and weathering of decades of struggle and challenges, and also the spirit fire of our mothers and grandmothers' tenacity to stay alive amidst the confusion. What they endured so that we could be here today, tending these shiny green sprouts of life that they so diligently tucked in the safety of dark soils, hidden from hungry and greedy hands until generations later they could emerge with renewed vigor and vibrancy. It was such scarification that has given the prayers the courage to sprout into our lives. And we are their wildest dreams sprouting and coming to life. They tried to bury us, but they did not know we were seeds. So again, breathe into that a bit. Allow those words to flow into your body, into your breath. Maybe we could just take one more deep breath and finding what I call the headwaters of our breath. Finding that place, that source where we have that connection to that mycelial, generational tributaries of connection between our bloodlines and that sweet womb water of our mothers and grandmothers. So this is the place where I approach my work, is from the heart, right? We brought the corn here, the corn mother. This is the place where I root my work into, is it coming at it from a place of reverent curiosity. So I'm going to weave that in to our stories as we move through our time here today. But what I wanted to say is who I come here representing. So I come here representing the Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, which is a national network of Indigenous leaders dedicated to restoring our Indigenous foodways and our self-determination, our community wellness. And so we work to center the autonomy of our tribal nations to create kin-centric relational ways of nourishment in our food. We have a seed to table vision that we are uplifting from the generations of people whose work our work rides on and works from. And so we use this to encompass our community vision of food sovereignty and sustainable Indigenous food systems. This starts with community access to traditional and regionally adapted seed and cycles directly back to family kitchens and seed banks and tables. So we ultimately recognize that you cannot separate agriculture and seed keeping from cooking and nutrition and our cultural lifeways. And so this circular seasonal patterns directly informs our work that we do. Oops. And the mission of, and so within this work at NAFSA, Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance, I have been one of many people to found what we call the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, which again, I'll drop into the chat later on, some places where you can find our work, where you can watch some of our videos and our storytelling there. But what we do is we work to nourish and assist the growing seed sovereignty movement across Turtle Island, leveraging resources, cultivating solidarity, and essentially creating, revitalizing and nourishing the kinship and trade routes that have existed since time immemorial on Turtle Island and beyond. So you can continue to check out our work. And that's really what I'm here to talk about, is talk into some of the stories from our work. So the topic of today's conversation is looking into what is a relational agriculture and what is rematriation. And this is about coming home. It's about healing through reconnection and rehydration of relationships. And so you can see some of the folks that I've brought into this space through these pictures are people who I consider elders and friends and compadres along this beautiful path that we walk in our work. As we lean into this idea of a kinship-centered agriculture, right? We have, we're approaching this in a time and space of being surrounded by an industrial agriculture and a Western scientific and a values-based place where we look at the agricultural systems are very exploitative and extractive and come from a very different value set because of the impact of colonization and capitalism. But as Indigenous peoples, we are deeply rooted from generations upon generations into a kinship-centered agriculture and foodways and ways of nourishing ourselves. And so this is us being in relationship to the land. It's us having a relationship and agreements with the waters. It's us sitting here being informed by our ancestors and also thinking as future ancestors in our ancestor mind, and thinking about creating nourishing foodways that honor our descendants, and recognizing that we borrow the land and the water and the seeds from our children, right? This kinship-centered agriculture includes seeds of all kinds, and we're going to talk into all kinds of stories of the cultural dimension of biodiversity, which is a huge, is centered me on this path for a long time. We're going to talk about the way in which resources and wealth weave into this tapestry of kinship-centered agriculture, the way that cultural memory and ceremony are at the very center of the way in which we move in our kinship-centered foodways, and the ways that we are continuing to rehydrate trade routes and kinship routes to continue to recognize that the diversity of tribal nations that have inhabited Turtle Island, North America, since time immemorial, have created an intertribal and intercultural agricultural system that is beautifully woven and has a vision of sustainability into the future. So some of this work is, whether it's rematriation or this vision of a relational agriculture, we talk about kinning, this as a verb, like how are we continuing to make kin with the world around us. And I'm going to speak a little bit more into this idea of rematriation because it's about reconnection. And it's an invitation that I will extend to each and every one of you as we move along this path, is that we're all in a process. If we want to see that radical, beautiful future that we know is possible for our children, we must all engage in a path of rematriation so that we can reconnect and rekin to the land around us, and to create a more kin-centric version of nourishing ourselves that is continuing to be generative as opposed to extractive from the environment that we live in. And this work is collective, right? Like what I'm going to bring here to you today is a lot of stories of success, a lot of stories of resilience from the collective movement inside of our Indigenous food sovereignty movement, right? And those are the things that we celebrate. But I think what we don't often talk about enough, and I think I'll weave a little bit of that in, and I'm actually writing a memoir right now that speaks into more of the vulnerable, intimate, individual pathways that we are also have to engage in when we're making change in the world, right? So we have an opportunity to do this collective movement work, but simultaneously we have to be doing that intimate, individual work inside of our own selves to continue to make that change. And I know that we're a diverse circle here. When we sit here together, we come from many different backgrounds. We come from many different ethnicities and cultural groups. And when we talk about rematriation and reconnection and creating foodways and ways of nourishing ourselves that are absolutely reflecting the abundance of Mother Earth and the gifts that she offers to us, we would be remiss to not talk about why this is so important to speak to right now, and grappling with the understanding of diaspora and the way that diaspora has impacted each and every one of us sitting here in the circle now, but also each and every one of us on the globe, that not one of us is untouched by the grief, the cultural insanity, and the impact of the many diasporas that exist today, right? So myself as a Haudenosaunee woman, as a Ganyak Gehaga woman, a Mohawk woman, who is still living on the continent of her ancestors, I still grapple with the diaspora. And I'll speak a little bit into that as it relates to my own family and the ways that cultural upheaval have impacted my family's connection to land and the things that we're doing to revitalize that. But each and every one of us in our own ways is grappling with a cultural and or physical diaspora that we have to grapple with, right? If we want to come together and build this intercultural, diverse, kin-centric, relational agriculture and nourishment landscape that we know is possible. And so we have to center our understanding and root into this is the deeper cultural work of what we're attempting to accomplish here in this time. So I bring in this picture because it's little me, little Rowie, growing this lumpy, bumpy pumpkin in my backyard as a young girl, probably at 5 or 6. And I was from the get-go, from a very young age, I had a penchant, a desire, an innate connection with the land, right? And was always asking my mother if we could grow things in the backyard. And they always chuckled and laughed because my great-grandfather, who's there in the suspenders, Alex White, and his son, Lincoln White, they were farmers and they had a livelihood of tending to the land and stewarding the land. And they always said, oh, those memories, that cellular memory of you knowing what it means to stick your hands in the earth and cultivate food and seed is in your bloodlines. And so my individual, intimate, vulnerable story of reconnection is that as a modern day Indigenous woman, navigating the immensity of the cultural upheaval and all of the ways in which acculturation and assimilation and colonialism has impacted me and has impacted my family, I, at a very young age, decided that it was going to be through food and seed that I would find my way home, right? So at 17, I found myself a young woman living on an organic farm, wanting to learn about the seeds and foods that fed my ancestors. And what that made me do was reach back just a generation or two to my closest ancestors who were ones who did tend the land and steward the land in beautiful ways. This is my grandmother, Emily White. Her Mohawk name was Wa'anyahawe, which means she who carries apples or she who carries fruit. And these are some of the pieces from her own journals that I've been weaving into my own memoir writing, because she, as well as the other two gentlemen that you saw in the slide, they were part of the generations that were taken away to residential boarding schools as a part of the colonial project in North America, that were essentially trying to sever our connection to the land and sever our connection to our language and our culture, and was a violent legacy that I think the US and Canada are still trying to grapple with. But these people were farmers. They grew up doing amazing things, but their connection was severed. And so my parents, this woman here, she spoke Mohawk as a first language, but she was, in her own handwriting, you were punished and your sin was unthinkingly slipping into your Mohawk tongue, right? So she spoke Mohawk as a first language, but was challenged to speak English and in very violent ways. And her family were disconnected from the land. And that created a ripple of change where that language wasn't spoken to my parents. And then that language was not spoken to me. And the understanding of farming as a life way, there was so many dominoes that happened. And here are some more pictures of some of my ancestors. And to them, I say, your hands planted seeds, and you harvested foods, and you prepared meals, and you swaddled babies, and you fixed fences. I just imagine the ways in which they delighted in the births and wept at the passings. I'm thankful for all the memories that have passed along my rivers of time that run through my blood and my bones. And so I look in my work, I look to these immediate ancestors who endured unspeakable atrocities, not very long ago, and I say to them that my hands are their hands, and their story is now woven into my story, and they are who I root into as I continue to be on the front lines of change, of seeding this relational agriculture, that I look to them, and that it's in honor of them that I do this work. I have the great good fortune of being raised by parents who, while they were not farmers or land stewards in a way, because of the impacts of the residential schools on my particular bloodlines, I was raised by activists who were very involved in land sovereignty work. So my dad is a tribal attorney who now serves our Okosasne Mohawk tribe, but he and my mother, who's a paralegal, they spent time in the front lines and in the trenches working and fighting for Indigenous land sovereignty through an organization called Native American Rights Fund. And so I feel as though my work and the work of many of us in this movement is informed by our parents and grandparents who stood on the front lines and recognized the very importance of land, fishing rights, water rights, and all of these things to the dignified resurgence of our Indigenous peoples and our lifeways. And so my work also stands upon the shoulders of my parents and my aunties and uncles in that movement work, growing up in the Indigenous land sovereignty movement and being informed. And so my work is a divergence off of their work in going deeper into how are we resourcing and building capacity to build this relational agriculture that we hold vision for in our Indigenous communities. And so for me, the land became this fertile root and foundation to my own personal journey of rematriation. And as I always say, the background is a farm in Western Massachusetts. I attended Hampshire College in the Pioneer Valley and found myself on a beautiful, diverse organic farm in that valley. And that land became the foundation of my own personal journey to reclaim what had been taken from my bloodlines and from my family. And I always say, I found myself on this organic farm tending to heirloom seeds. Like, this idea of heirloom seeds was first introduced to me, that seeds were intimately connected to people across generations and lineages, that seeds were inherently adapted to a very specific bioregion. And as I began to apprentice myself not only to humans, but also to my more than human kin, these plants, the land and the seeds were my teachers, my mentors, my aunties, my grandmas in a very unconventional rites of passage. So I grew up in a time where my generation did not have the benefit of having our rites of passage or our puberty rites still intact, although we're seeing a resurgence of that. And I'll speak a little bit to that as it relates to the role that plays in our cultural agriculture. But the plants and the land took me through a very unconventional rites of passage, where I began to learn what it meant to be a Mohawk woman in my full capacity, to carry a seed bundle, to carry the cultural memory and the stories that were necessary to steward that seed bundle well. And so it was folks like this, people in this picture, elders from our Haudenosaunee communities across New York, Southern Quebec and Ontario, who at 17, I began to ask myself, who were the seeds and foods that fed my ancestors, right? And how can I find meaningful reconnection to these lifeways that will help me to understand the bigger cosmovision, the cosmology, the stories of my people, the ceremonies of my people. And it's people who are shown here today that entrusted me with bundles of heirloom seeds of corn, of beans, of squash, of sunflowers, of tobacco, who picked off jars off their, dusty pantry shelves, and who were waiting for young women like myself to return home and say, I want to be the one in my family and my bloodlines that did not forget the importance of seeds and food and connection to plants, right? And it was at a time 25 plus years ago that I think many of my elders were beginning to lose hope that there was going to be a next generation of young people who understood the value of that, right? In the time of mass distraction and assimilation and acculturation, who was going to be that young next generation to come along? Because as I'd like to remind you all, this work of seed stewardship and seed keeping and land stewardship and agriculture, it's intergenerational work, right? It's work that never ends because those seeds need one generation after another. Those seeds will always outlive us as humans. But we as humans have a responsibility to steward that next generation of young folks who are going to carry the responsibility of not only tending to the seeds, but the cultural memory that they carry. And as an elder of mine always said, the seeds are a reflection of the people. And so I'm going to talk into, in this space, a little bit of the ways in which the seeds that I carry in my bundle and the seeds that we're finding in many different tribal communities, seed bundles, are as diverse as the people who carried them, right? There's this cultural dimension of biodiversity. And these people who have, our Haudenosaunee people who have a very specific spiritual and cultural agreements that have been handed down from one generation to another that include that bundle of seeds and include the seed songs and the stories that accompany those seeds. That is a beautiful reflection of the vibrant relational agriculture that is possible on Turtle Island and had been in place in pre-colonial times since time immemorial, right? An agriculture that was always flexible and adapting to the face of our Mother Earth in a way that was generative, in a way that was abundant, in a way that was not extractive and exploitative, right? And it was a reflection of the values of the people. Now, we live in a time in industrial agriculture where, you can go into the heartland of America and see the hillsides planted with GMO corn, right? Hybrid corn, GMO corn, seeds. We have the technology now where you essentially can cut and splice certain gene sequences and generate plants in a very Jurassic Park type way where you don't even need actual holistic seeds, and they do not treat seeds as sovereign whole beings. And that is a reflection of the value set of that industrial agriculture. And so me, as a young woman coming into this work, I began to see the industrial food landscape as almost like an anti-relational system, right? It was actually like very non-conducive to relationality. And those seeds, the ones that are GMO, which are cut and spliced from all of these different genetic sequences and a patchwork together, were also a reflection of the culture of people who made them, right? And one time I said it was brokenhearted people planting brokenhearted seeds, right? People who were living in a diaspora, who'd come to this continent as settlers, who maybe over the generations had forgotten who they were and who had forgotten who they'd come from, and were continuing to build and cultivate an agricultural system that was a reflection of that disconnection, was a reflection of that lack of reverence, of that lack of reciprocity. But what I would like to remind you all in this space, and as we continue to tell story in this space, is that each and every one of us, no matter where you come from, you descend from people who had beautiful storied cosmologies and cosmogenealogies and cosmovisions of seeds as beautiful ancestors and relatives, right? You all come from people that had those stories. And so this rematriation work is not only just for Indigenous peoples here, but it's for each and every one of us to reconnect in meaningful ways to the foods and seeds that fed our ancestors and continue to feed us today. These elders here who I bring into this space, they remind me that a long, long time ago, our ancestors came into beautiful, storied agreements with plants, that those plants would give up a little bit of their wildness, and and humans would give up a little of our wildness, and we would come together in this mutual reciprocity of caring for one another. And what I like to remember and remind you all in this space is that those seeds never gave up on us, right? So if you ate today, if you came in here and had nourishment in your belly, or if you had nourishment in your dinner last night, that those seeds never gave up on their agreements to take care of us as people. But over time, through immense cultural upheaval from many different cultures and communities, the people in many, many ways began to forget our mutual reciprocal agreement with the seeds to take care of them, right? And so part of this work is a love poem. It's a vibrant invitation to find your way back into mutually beneficial relationships with seeds. And that's not just farmers and gardeners. That's each and every one of us. So what are the ways in which each and every one of us in our daily lives are finding meaningful ways to reconnect to ancestral food, to this relational agriculture, and weave this beautiful tapestry of life? And, these seeds are a reflection of our Indigenous resilience across time, right? So as a young woman at 17, I began to ask those questions of my community. What were the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors, right? And I came across beautiful old plates like this in books that were written by ethnographers at the turn of the century in the early 1900s that said that they were gathering information about Haudenosaunee foodways and agriculture and our cultural ways, because they thought that we were in a culture that was becoming extinct because of, again, the colonial project. And that was from the white-led institutions. They believed that we were, in 100 years, we were no longer going to be planting our foods and seeds. And so we come across old photos like this. This was taken in the early 1900s, in 1906, by a man named F.W. Waugh, who wrote a book called Iroquois and Iroquois Foodways. But what I come here to share is a story of hope that says, in 100+ years since there was this prediction that our people would not be planting our beautiful, diverse, organic heirloom seeds, that I am work alongside hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are proving them wrong and saying that we indeed are resilient in the face of the immensity of cultural upheaval that has happened over the last century, and we are continuing to plant our foods and seeds. And you can see that there have been incredibly reverberating impacts of settler colonialism on the relationships to the land, and not only with humans, but also our more than human relatives, right? So you can see here on the map that in the 1650 representation of the map, you have the Haudenosaunee. At that point, it was 5 nations. Eventually, it becomes 6. Had relationships and agreements with land, with the land, in a way of the Mohawks being the keepers of the eastern door, the Seneca being keepers of the western door, and they, we moved in seasonal ways across the land, and there's been an incredible cost of the loss of land base. You see in the 21st century, you can see the small, tiny bits of land that Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee people continue to steward, and that has a reverberating impact on not only the health and well-being of our people and our ability to continue to steward and care for our seeds and for our land and for our traditional foods, but also the more than human relatives that are woven into those relational agriculture. Because when we begin to talk into this vision of relational agriculture, it's actually not an agriculture that's just beneficial to humans. It's actually an agriculture that's beneficial to our more than human relatives as well. And so we would be remiss to not acknowledge that 1.5 billion acres of land was stolen from Indigenous nations in the US, either by executive order signed under, or treaties signed under duress. And so the Northeast was settled prior to 1776 and is primarily unceded territory stolen from our indigenous peoples. And this is a representation of during the Revolutionary War, when George Washington, upon orders, or gave orders to George Sullivan to come into our Haudenosaunee communities and burn our cornfields, right? And there was a very specific reason for that, because the foods and our connection to the land is what gives us our innate power as indigenous peoples, right? Our innate power is held in the earth, and we resource our power, our like that deep, enduring, timeless power by our connection, getting our hands in the earth, eating foods from the earth, being in ceremonial reciprocity with that earth, and renewing our agreements season after season. And so if our foods were inaccessible to us because of the burning of the cornfields, that would weaken us as a people, and we would become more dependent and more likely to assimilate to the powers that be. But we know that this movement is a testament to the resilience of our indigenous communities and our commitment to that dignified resurgence. And so as we begin to talk into what is it going to take to bring us into a more relational agriculture, and a relational landscape of nourishment, language is important. What are the words that we're using to engage in this work? Where can we imagine we need a new lexicon? I often speak and write into this idea of English being a very limiting lexicon and language for actually what we are envisioning, and that perhaps we need to lean into our indigenous languages to, sorry, my cat is meowing in the background, is to conjure up, like, what are the ways in which the English language actually limits our radical imaginations of what's possible in this relational agriculture. And so we've used the word rematriate, which is to restore, some people say that it's to restore a people to their rightful place in sacred relationship to the ancestral land. But you can also see there's lots of different words that, weave into this work: reclamation, reconciliation, restorative justice. There's a lot of ways in which we are using the English language to try and encompass this work that we're doing here. My cat is trying to me nuts. So when we talk about rematriation, we talk about, some people know what repatriation is, which is the bringing home of, ancestral or funerary objects or things that were stolen from communities. We've chosen to use this word rematriation, which is centering indigenous leadership, restoring agency and autonomy and sovereignty into our work. It's a vital sort of reframe, because I think that part of, again, this rematriation movement is about finding our way home and bringing seeds home and reconnecting humans to land and bringing ancestral people back into relationship with ancestral lands. But it's something, I think, that's even bigger around just reconnecting ourselves in meaningful ways to what it means to individually uphold these sacred and spiritual agreements that we have with land and food and seed. And so, as again, we talked about that, the Venn diagram of the collective versus the individual. In the collective work that we're doing in the rematriation movement, which is, again, the way that we talk about this restoration of this relational agriculture, we're seeing ceremonial renewal of relationships on the collective level. We're witnessing intercultural relationship building, not only intertribal, with tribes working together with other tribes to continue to build relationships that existed across, the tapestry of Turtle Island, since, time immemorial, but also finding ways for the new, the settlers, the immigrants, the Black bodies who are brought here, against their will, historically. What are the ways in which we are weaving the diversity of people who now live on Turtle Island into this new vision of agriculture? Because it is an intercultural movement. What are the ways in which we are unpacking indigenous settler power dynamics and looking at the ways that this work can continue to move us towards a more just and equitable landscape of nourishment? a part of this work is about restoring the commons, and that idea of commons, that idea of moving in anti-capitalist ways, against sort of this proprietorship and the cutting and splicing up of the lands in so many different ways. What are the ways in which our work is inherently working to restore that commons? And how are we coming up with renewed collective agreements to reciprocity to the land, to seeds, and to cultural memory? And as Indigenous peoples, how are we creating leadership as the original stewards of this land to bring along the diversity of folks who now inhabit Turtle Island, and to help them find their place in our cosmovision and our understanding of what a more beautiful and just and I guess irresistible future of nourishment could be. And as individuals, what are the ways in which we are taking the opportunity to reconnect in meaningful ways to community, recognizing that growing, this myth of self-sufficiency and self-sustainability, that's not an option. Like we have to nourish ourselves in community. We have nourished ourselves in community since time immemorial across the globe, from wherever you come from. And this is about rehydrating relationships, right? It's about ways that we are unearthing these relationships, not only to each other as humans, but to the land around us. And how are we, extending that kinship with our other more than human relatives? So much of this work on both an individual level and also a collective level, but I sort of center it in this individual level because I feel as though there's this deep, intimate, vulnerable work that has to be done on a somatic level to heal intergenerational trauma. And what I found as a student of agriculture for over 25 years is that, and now being a student of somatic abolitionism with Res Romanicum and doing a lot of somatic work myself, is that agricultural work is somatic, right? It's this way when we put our hands in the earth, we feel a sense of calm, we feel a sense of relief, we can give over our griefs, we can give over our burdens to the land who can compost them in deep, meaningful ways and metabolize the griefs and pains that we carry as living in this modern world. Again, coming back to that idea that not one of us is untouched by the grief of disconnection. And so when we reconnect to the land, we plant our seeds. I have the great good fortune of being a mentor to many different people, teaching them how to farm, teaching them how to seed keep, and watching just them change and the way that their face lights up and their heart lights up when they reconnect in meaningful ways to the land. So we are inherently healing that intergenerational trauma as we engage in this work, and we are creating opportunities for re-narrativizing our dignified resurgence. So instead of being many Indigenous peoples grew up in the struggle and grew up in communities that are very marginalized and who are very, defined by our historical trauma and all of the ways that is expressed. And so what are the ways in which we are centering our stories of dignified resurgence and sharing that with our communities? Because when I came into this work, there was a lot of doom and gloom, even from our elders, of who's going to continue to do this work. And so how are we building storied movements of hope where young people feel like they want to be a part of this movement? And when they become involved, it continues to amplify that they have a place and that we are creating a culture of belonging inside of this work. And so, at its core, this rematriation means a restoration of relationships at the individual level and at the collective level. And it's intergenerational in that we need young folks, we need elders, we need all the in between, and we need everyone involved in this. And so I often say to the people in my work that let us not be defined by our intergenerational trauma of having to carry the blood memory of the 500 plus years of resisting colonial violence, but let us be animated by our ancestral brilliance that runs in our blood and our bones, right? So many of the people that I have the good fortune of working alongside have this incredible sparkle of ancestral brilliance. And how are we weaving that ancestral brilliance and creating safe places that are trauma informed to continue to create that vision of a more abundant and beautiful future. And that's what trauma does to us, right? For those of you who are trauma informed, trauma actually affects, like from a scientific perspective, it impacts our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that enables us to see ourselves into the future, right? And so, so as we do this work from a trauma informed somatic place, from a somatic place, we are we activate and create spaciousness and create the possibility for us to engage in our radical imaginations and engage in that ability to see ourselves into the future with that ancestral brilliance. And so that's a big part of my work as I have continued to do the seed work and land stewardship work, is creating containers where we can speak into and vision and dream into that more beautiful future. And that encompasses this idea of this cultural dimension of biodiversity. Look at how beautiful this is, this array of beings, you know, it's a prism, it's a rainbow, it's a spectrum of diversity from, you know, these tiny little yellow beans all the way to these speckled red beans and the striped, zebra striped beans. These are beans that have descended from indigenous peoples, from hands of, this is like grandma science, from one grandmother to the next to the next. Each one has its own unique flavor, has its own unique way of growing on the earth. Some of these beans grow well in dry times. Some of these beans grow well in wet times. Some of them grow somewhere in between. And our ancestors, they knew the value of this diversity, right? And so in many indigenous bean varieties, there is a lot of inherent diversity. We call them land races. The seed varieties have a lot of this inherent diversity in them because our ancestors knew that the face of our Mother Earth was constantly changing, right? Some years would be hot and dry, some would be cold and wet. And so they always planted with that diversity of seeds, knowing that in any one season, there would be at least something to feed our people, because we didn't have the Cisco's and the Walmarts and everything from it. You know, so we were reliant upon the food and seeds that fed our communities season in and season out. And so this value of diversity became encoded into our culture. And so when we look now with this resurgence of an understanding and appreciation of heirloom seeds and you know, diverse seeds, when you look at pages of seed catalogs, all of those seeds have provenance or have lineage back to an indigenous community, whether it's on Turtle Island or elsewhere, whether it's in Europe or Africa or Asia. All of those seeds have provenance and lineage across many, many, many generations that evolved those seeds to be able to be adaptive to the ever-changing face of our Mother Earth. And culture is a collective ongoing practice that strengthens kinship, right? So my approach to cultivating cultures of care and belonging in foodways is inherently cultural centric. Like, I don't think that we can create a vision of what a relational agricultural system or, you know, agricultural landscape looks like into the future without it being an act of revitalizing some sort of life-giving culture, right? And so I descend from a life-giving culture that you know, I'm going to tell some of the stories from my people that reinforce that. And so culture is this collective ongoing practice that strengthens culture. And ceremonies are the way that we show renewed commitment to that and devotion to tending these reciprocal relationships, right? So when I go into ceremony, and I'll share a little bit of some of the cycles of ceremony that we have, we're paying homage to those seeds. We're asking for, you know, we're renewing those agreements that we would take care of those seeds all around this way. And so agriculture is cultural work. And so what are the ways in which we as a collective, as we envision what is a more radical way that we can nourish ourselves on this planet in a way that is generative and abundant and not exploitative and extractive? That's culture work, right? We have to grow ourselves into people who see ourselves as see the seeds as babies or children, or see the earth as mother, right? And what we have now is a cultural collision of many, many people on the earth who live in a diasporic reality, a cultural diasporic reality, where they have lost connection to those stories that help them to understand their place on the earth, right? And so what are the ways in which the agriculture can be a reflection of those stories of connection and those stories of belonging and and create cultural sanity again, right? And so in our communities, we have, this is a very like rudimentary sort of wheel of our agriculture, and so at the beginning in January is our new year, and is the time and place where we are lunar and star people. So our ceremonies are actually guided by new moons and by star constellations. So in January is when we have our midwinter ceremony, which is a few days after the new moon, when Pleiades is directly overhead. And it's the time where we see that the seeds are dreaming, right? If you imagine the landscape of our agricultural cycle as the life cycle of a plant, in January, that's actually the beginning of our agricultural calendar, because that's when life starts. When you plant a seed, it doesn't just instantly turn into a sprout. There's a time and period where it is down below the earth. It's dreaming, it's imagining, it's gaining courage to break open out of that seed coat and sprout into something life-giving and nourishing, right? And so in January, in the like below the soil phase, that's when our seeds are dreaming. We're praying for a good year. We're waking the seeds up. We're starting to say, hey, who's going to be planted in our gardens? And then, we wait for the thunderers that come, in the springtime. They're the ones who re-energize the earth and wake up the seeds and start that like beginning of sprouting and that new transition into that phase of our agriculture. We have, different dances and ceremonies that we do. We have seed blessings. We have seed ceremonies where we sing songs of praise to those seeds, right? I have songs that we carry that have been with those seeds since time immemorial, since our original ancestors carried those seeds, right? We have plant songs and prayers and ceremonies that follow our planting cycles all the way around to the harvest. So each and every one of these ceremonies is a renewal of our agreement and our commitment to those seeds and to those foods. And in one seed song from an Anishinaabe elder, it's called Maji Ishka, and Maji Ishka is a word that would an Anishinaabe midwife would say, and that word means come in your own time, right? So the seed song that an Anishinaabe midwife shared with me, it says Maji Ishka, Mani Dumines, Ashkena Minu Bena Dezoin, and it means sacred seed, come in your own time. We humbly implore you that you might give us good life, right? And so our seed songs are often sharing that sentiment where it's actually decentering human agency and saying, the seeds are coming forth, the harvest is coming forth, the ability for the seeds to sprout out of the ground and show their faces is a gift to us, right? Those plants are giving that gift to us, right? And so that's a cultural shift where we're acknowledging that we're actually not the ones in control, and that we are meeting these seeds halfway and doing the best that we can, and so Maji Ishka is something that a midwife would say to a woman in labor, right? So it would be like, come in your own time, baby, when the woman's giving birth. And so as a seed keeper, I'm a plant midwife, right? I'm saying to those seeds when they're sprouting or when they're forming their fruits and when they're coming to fruition, when we can harvest those seeds, I'm saying, come when you're ready. And when you come, you are a sacred gift to me. And it is because of your generosity and benevolence that I have good life, right? And so imagine that kind of agriculture, right, that exists. And it's not idealistic. My people, when George Washington sent his troops into Haudenosaunee territories to burn those cornfields, there are records in place that said that they burnt over 1 million bushels of corn, right? And so that is like people-powered agriculture. There were no tractors, there was no fossil fuels, there was none of that. Our people, in collective ways, were growing immense amount of seed and food in a culturally reverent way, right? And so that is possible. Sometimes I think we get so limited by like modern technology to understand what is actually possible for the future of food. And in lots of ways, you see our reverence for these seeds and these foods show up in many different cultural ways. In our longhouses, we dance actually counterclockwise. So if you look back at let's see this slide. If you look back, our ceremonial calendar actually goes counterclockwise around. We don't move in a clockwise way, we move in a counterclockwise way. And the reason why is that we dance in our longhouses, or we understand the way that time moves the same way that beans dance around corn. So when we plant in our Three Sisters garden, with the corn being the trellis and the strong sister holding the world up, and the beans dancing and growing around the corn, they always grow in a counterclockwise way. And so if you begin to engage your reverent curiosity in the world, you begin to see that all vines grow in that way. They grow counterclockwise. And from our teachings, it's the way in which the moon, our grandmother moon, has influence on the way that those plants grow in that way, right? And so we pay homage to the way that those natural ways of life emerging, that's reflected in the way that we dance, in the way that we give ceremony, in the way that we actually see time unfurling on the earth, right? And so that's just, and so what is important, and again, so much of my writing right now and my research is really trying to continue to emphasize and scream this out into the world, or perhaps sing it out into the world, is that if we want to see a culture of, we want to see a future of beautiful relational agriculture, Indigenous peoples must be the leader to that. And science is showing us that. Indigenous peoples are 4% of the world's population. We inhabit 22% of the Earth's surface. And on that land is 80% of the planet's remaining biodiversity, right? And this is scientifically proven. You have maps here. The map on top here is a map of the biodiversity hotspots across the globe. And the map that you see in the bottom corner is the places where Indigenous languages are still spoken. So there's this correlation between when Indigenous languages are still spoken, which is kind of a cultural marker or reflection of a culture still intact and still living in those Indigenous intact cultural ways. It's almost an exact replica, right? So we are recognizing that Indigenous land stewardship and Indigenous seed stewardship create enclaves of both cultural and climate sanity, right? And so Pamela McElwee says this is a watershed moment in acknowledging that Indigenous and local communities play a vital role in maintaining and managing biodiversity and landscapes that the rest of us can learn from, right? This isn't rocket science. This is Indigenous peoples living under these sacred spiritual agreements that have been handed down from generation to generation inside of seed bundles, inside of, the connections to the land, right? In California, we're seeing Indigenous people taking leadership in reintroducing fire back into the landscape, which increases the biodiversity on the land, and it enables the wild and domestic food plants to flourish and thrive, right? And so that is why this call to action for me to center Indigenous leadership in this is so vitally important, because when Indigenous people steward land and steward seed, that's where the diversity is. And as we know, our resilience is rooted in this biodiversity, right? So intact Indigenous cultures safeguard and culturally encode the value of diversity, which is the root of our resilience. So as I came into this work as a young woman and began to go back into my Indigenous communities and gather seed bundles and gather the good foods of my people, and they were entrusted, to these seeds, I wasn't just handed one type of corn, right? Like a white corn or yellow corn that so many of us, are used to seeing. I was handed red corns and blue corns and multicolored calico corns and purple corns and black sweet corns and white corns that were long, over a foot long, and white corns that were super tiny and little. And so there were all of these different corn varieties that were a part of our Haudenosaunee seed bundle. And there were dozens of different types of beans and half a dozen different types of squashes, right? And not only were there a diversity inside of a crop type, right? Like dozens of different corns and dozens of different types of beans, but even inside of those varieties, like when I would plant the red corn, there would always be all kinds of different shades of red or all kinds of different shades of blue that would be held in one variety, because that diversity is so critical. And our communities, our ancestors, they knew the value of that diversity. But it wasn't just enough to value it. It wasn't just enough to know that, hey, we need these varieties, this diversity to continue to evolve to the face of our changing Mother Earth, but they found ways to safeguard it and encode it into our ceremonies. So for instance, when we have a naming ceremony as Haudenosaunee people, we need the blue corn in order to prepare a certain meal in order to have that ceremony, right? And in order to have a wedding, you need the red corn. And in order to do the certain children's ceremony, you need the multicolored corn, right? And so our ancestors were very, very brilliant and smart, and knowing that we as humans, we have many follies and we are oftentimes amnesiacs and just forget. And so they encoded the value of that diversity and said, okay, in order to have this ceremony, which is something that we are mandated to do, they tied it and encoded value to that specific seed color and that specific seed variety, right? We have a variety of beans that's said to be the very first beans that were given to us from our original ancestors, and songs that go with it, right? So we use culture as a way to encode and safeguard that value of seeds, because we know that it's key to our survival as people. And again, you can see, I just bring up this image again of these, all the different types of corn that Haudenosaunee people steward. And there's very specific recipes, there's ceremonies that those seed relatives play a role in, and they're vital. And this is a beautiful artistic representation of a very beautiful and multi-layered cosmology that we have as Haudenosaunee people. As you've heard me say, and I'm sure you've heard others say, that we live on Turtle Island, and that harkens back to our creation story, where our original ancestor, who was a woman who came from a place called Sky World, fell through a hole in their village where a tree had been uprooted, grasping seeds from that Sky World, and fell into a place, a great watery abyss. And the benevolent turtle lifted up its back so that this original woman, who was not a water being, could have some place to land with these seeds in hand. And the many waterfowl and water beings of this place were benevolent to this original ancestor of ours, the Sky Woman. And when she landed on Turtle Island, she took those seeds and she began to sing the world awake. These seeds that she had in her hand were wild seeds of the Sky World, the place where there was no agriculture, but there was hunting and foraging and like the wild places. So in some ways, the story of a new world being birthed is likely the story of the invention of agriculture, or like the emergence of agriculture in our communities, right? It was such a revolution that we lived in ways that were dependent upon our relationship with the wild plants and the wild animals. And when corn came our way, it was so revolutionary that there was this whole new world that was being birthed. And so Sky Woman began to sing this new world awake, and she was pregnant, and soon she gave birth to a young child, a girl. And they too, these original women, began to sing this world awake, right? And make the beautiful earth that we all know around us be the way that it is. And then soon, as she came of age, the young woman who was born here on Turtle Island, Sky Woman's daughter, became impregnated from the west winds, and she grew ripe and big with twins. And eventually she had twins, and one was born naturally, Sapling, and Flint, who had a hard ridge on its head, was born unnaturally, cutting through his mother's armpits. And so as the original woman's daughter lay dying in childbirth, she said that the foods and seeds that would sustain our people would grow from her body, and corn grew from her breasts, and beans grew from her hands, and squashes grew from her umbilicus, from the, like the belly button, and strawberries from her heart, and sunflowers and potatoes from her legs, and tobacco from her head, right? And so in that way, we are literally lineal descendants of our traditional foods and seeds, right? Those seeds sprouted from the body of one of our original ancestors. And so it's not actually a metaphor that these seeds are our relatives. They are literally, we literally descend from them, and it's a part of our responsibility to take for them. And these seeds in this landscape, they hold our stories. And so part of this work is restoring relationships and agreements with this cosmogenealogy that exists within Indigenous seeds. And many different people the world over, Indigenous communities, have stories of relationship like that, where they are literally related to the foods and seeds that we tend and care for, right? And so we, in our cultural ways, like in our rites of passage and our puberty rites, we actually teach this story to our young people, because what it's important to remember is that the creation story never ended. There's never an ending to a creation story. It continues to unfurl each and every moment around us, and it's this blueprint that reminds us of who we are and how we're held in the world. And so our young people make sky women gardens, where they make gardens in the shape of original woman's daughter, where these crops are sprouting from her body. And we're reminded that each and every spring and each and every ceremonial season, that we are renewing our agreements to these plants and to our ancestors and to those ones who gave their life so that we could have life, right? And so I just think that bringing these stories in is so important, because it helps us to understand this bigger picture. And so in my work, we are also using rematriation to encompass the idea of returning these ancestral seeds or land races back to our original Mother Earth, where they'll be nourished and protected. And so we are finding seeds like the ones you see, like the red corn I was just talking about, all the beautiful shades of red that are held in one variety. We're finding them in places. Seeds move, and they move across landscapes, and we're finding them because of the cultural upheaval and colonialism and the loss of land. These seeds moved their way out across kinship routes and trade routes, and have found themselves in museums and seed banks and universities. These are our living relatives, and we're finding that we have to come up with new ceremonies to welcome them home. So as we bring our ancestral seeds back to life and continue to involve them in our ceremonies, and as we're inviting them back home from the travels that they've gone on, we are continuing to create those new ceremonies. And as a dear friend and elder of mine, Martin Prechtel, he says, it's not enough to save heritage seeds. The culture of those people to whom each seed belongs must be kept alive with seeds in their cultivation, not in freezers or museums, but in their own soil of their daily lives. Because we know that the land holds memory and story. And then in proximity to that, when we plant those seeds on the land, the seeds become the record keepers, right? They hold this unwritten language of evolution between plants and humans and land since time immemorial. And that's why I've devoted my life to seeds, because that imagery, that understanding of seeds being this record keeper across time is just, it's immensely intriguing to me, and it's always stimulating my curiosity. This is an old picture of Seneca elder Chauncey Johnny John, and he's standing in his cornfield, and he's pointing to the side of the mountain, because this place on earth is where, in some of the Haudenosaunee stories, where the place where the snake fell down, on this specific place on the earth is where something in our history and in our stories, this happened, right? And so that story is held in that land, similar to the way that Aboriginals in Australia have their song lines. These stories reside in the land, and many of these sacred places we no longer have access to because of colonialism and the lack of land tenure or ability to steward land and private land ownership. A lot of these places where stories sit and reside and live, we as Haudenosaunee people no longer have access to them. And so I shared with you, this is a rendition of our beautiful cosmology story. And there are many, many beautiful origin stories and creation stories across Turtle Island. And the land holds these stories. The land is who is the keeper of these stories. And that creation story never ended. And so much of this work is about tending these reciprocal relationships with plant relatives and creating landscapes of nourishment that are a reflection of those agreements, that and recognizing that revitalizing these seeds and these relationship to seeds and these relationships to land is an inextricable part of cultural revitalization and dignified resurgence. So some of the work that we're doing like practically to do this, like this was a lot of like story and like our values and our vision, but we are building culturally aligned food and seed hubs through our work at Indigenous Seed Keepers Network that have a set of guiding principles around collectivism, right? And intergenerational legacy building, of relationality over transactionality, aligning with solidarity economies that says that we are not going to do this work in food systems revitalization to create economies that actively harm what we love, right? That we're going to build economies of care that reflect our values, right? That this work, as we do this, and I'm going to share a few stories of where we're doing this in real time, is they're kin-centric, they're Indigenous led. This work is inherently decolonial because, as Audre Lorde says, the tools of the master cannot dismantle the master's house. So we are using our Indigenous radical imagination to ensure cooperative development that's pushing back on colonial structures, right? We're doing this work in a way that's trauma-informed and healing and social justice and equity centered. And we are also ensuring that culture and spirituality is at the very center of what we do. And so, we're working with communities like this, like we're in Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa communities. You can see the beautiful black and white photo in the upper right-hand corner of my screen is a woman named Scattered Corn. And she lived at a time of great upheaval on the Great Plains in North Dakota. She was a Mandan corn priestess who held the corn and seeds of her people in clan structures and the way that they had held their seeds in relationship. But she lived at a time where during the Homestead Act and the times when the homesteaders were sweeping across the plains, and she engaged with a family of a man named Oscar Will, who essentially was the nurseryman or the seedsman of sort of the pioneer the westward movement front in North Dakota. And she, Scattered Corn, and her son Holding Eagle would trade and share seeds with this white family and became very close and had a mutual relationship with this white family. It was a very unique and unconventional relationship at a time of great cultural upheaval for the Mandan and Arikara people. And they knew that like these seeds were going to have to be held by the hands of many. And so they traded those seeds with this white family. And some of those seeds generations later ended up in the Minnesota Museum of Science. You can see them here in the middle. And through our Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, the woman in the lower right-hand corner is a woman named Jamie Holding Eagle, who is the direct descendant of Scattered Corn and Holding Eagle, 3 generations removed. And we have been able to reconnect the Will family and the seeds that ended up in that Minnesota Museum of Science directly back to the Holding Eagle family and the Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa people. So this work is unearthing these stories of healing and these stories of resilience in this way that we're engaging with cross-cultural participatory ways of restoring foods. So these are seeds that are Haudenosaunee seeds that were being held inside of a seed bank in Iowa at Seed Savers Exchange. And we've engaged in a multi-year partnership with that particular entity to return culturally significant seeds back to our people, and centering Indigenous leadership, ecological knowledge, cultural memory, and autonomy, and over this cultural inheritance of our seeds and bringing them home again. So this is what I'm calling the reseeding of the people. It's like this fertile beginning of this all. which helps us return to cultural sanity and vibrant lifeways again. And I found this beautiful photo. I love to look at archival photos of agriculture across Indian country. And this one is from, I think, the late 30s, maybe in Okewinge, which is a pueblo in New Mexico. And I just love the joy that's so inherent in this picture with the young boys and the grandpa and the aunties. And I just have such a sensory feeling when I looked at this picture. I can imagine the smells, I can imagine the sounds, I can imagine the feeling of this. And so sometimes we have to, I have an elder who always says, it's like, love what you love more than you hate what you hate, right? So in the work that we do to dismantle the colonial industrial food systems, which is inherent in what we're doing, is that we're dismantling these systems that are not serving any one of us, and we're replacing them with something more generative and life-giving. We have to center the love of our people, the love of our seeds, the love of our land over constantly being at war with a system that does not serve us, right? And so I found a lot of people in movement work and community organizing work get extremely burned out because they're only fighting against something. And they're not centering their work about what are they living for? Like, what is the vision of what we're moving towards? Right. And so this is a reminder to us all of, like, if we envision cultural sanity and vibrant lifeways again, what does that look like? And how are we centering that in our work? And so I always am constantly anchoring into, what does this feel like? What does a relational system, this relational agricultural feel like? And my work is centered around the love of it all, right? And then, like, continuing to show up and resource myself in this work, and resource the people who are working alongside me to continue to show up in our love for this work. And so this particular family reminds me of that. And so Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, we're constantly hosting listening sessions to support our communities and seed sovereignty. And one of the biggest issues is that many people don't have access to culturally significant seeds because of the impact of colonization. And so we've partnered with institutions, museums, universities, places where some of these seed banks, where these seeds have traveled to, for many different reasons, and we're bringing these seeds home. So here's just a few of the hundreds of varieties that we've helped to rematriate and bring back into Indigenous care and Indigenous stewardship. Ganye's yellow-eye bean, Navajo robin's egg corn, Hidatsa red bean, etc. And so, again, we've partnered with Seed Savers Exchange to do this kind of work. Jessica Greendeer, who is one of many, many Indigenous seed keeper and farmers who are reclaiming bundles of seed of their ancestors. She speaks so beautifully about how this work of rematriation has helped reconnect her to parts of her culture, and that it's not just about growing seeds, but it's about cultivating that relationship and that whole history of that seed and that ancestral connection. And so you can find, we've partnered with organizations like Seed Savers Exchange to create webinars so we can highlight and uplift stories of Indigenous seed keepers, many of them women who are at the forefront of doing this healing work in their home communities. So you can find these webinars online on our YouTube channel. And this work, I always say, it's kerneling like seeds. It's rippling outward and creating many new partnerships. And you can see in these pictures that it's intercultural. There's people of all different cultural and ethnic backgrounds who are coming together to partner on this to work towards a more vibrant future. We've worked with the Meskwaki and the Field Museum to reunite them with seeds of their ancestors who were held in a museum in Chicago. And so learning about how to integrate those seeds back into their community. This picture always brings tears to my eyes when I look at it. I look at the care and reverence that these women from Taos Pueblo are cradling that squash. This is a squash that returned home to that traditional community of Taos in October of 2018. And I had the good fortune of helping to assist in that ceremony where we welcomed home these seeds. And you can just see, like, if there was a poster for relational agriculture, this would be it, right? Like Henrietta Gomez, they're cradling that squash as if it was a baby, right? And the emotion and the devotion that is held in the countenance of these women is so present and palpable and moving. And so this is the type of agriculture that we want, where we are bringing that love and devotion back into this work. In our Haudenosaunee communities, we are partnering with Seed Savers Exchange to, and also with the Hudson Valley Farm Hub and an entity called Seed Shed, and our members of our Akwesasne community. We've actually engaged in a partnership in the Hudson Valley where Haudenosaunee or Mohawk farmers have access to some of that traditional land that we had been displaced from, so that we can continue to grow our seed and food in environments that are more conducive than our community that's up on the St. Lawrence River, which would have been more traditionally hunting and fishing grounds as opposed to agricultural grounds. So we are working in partnership, moving towards reconciliation and reparations by planting these rematriation gardens and working together, building trust and healing Indigenous and settler relationships under the shade tree of this garden. So here's a picture of many of us who've been involved in this work. It started in, I think, 2014 or 2015. We've taken seeds like, for instance, the red corn, the Mohawk red corn seed that had literally dwindled down to just one cob of corn left in the hands of an elder up at Gotnawage Mohawk community over 20 years ago. And my seed elder, Steve McCumber, rescued that seed, shared it out with several of us, myself included. We ended up growing it here as a part of this Indigenous land rematriation project. And we ended up, we've ended up growing, I think, like probably at this point, maybe thousands of pounds of this seed and food to return back to our cultural community. You can see we would take van loads of corn and seeds and squashes back to our community to feed our school children, to feed our ceremonial communities. And that's this testament to this. And out of that work, that relational work that we were building in the Hudson Valley, we were able to create the Akwesasne Seed Hub in my home community, which is a living classroom that is it's basically an agricultural living campus that is adjacent to the Mohawk Immersion School, the Akwesasne Freedom School. And we've been able to raise $2.5 million to renovate the buildings there and to continue to make this way of learning and this way of life accessible to the young people in our community. We're seeing this rematriation work impact places in Mexico where they're changing policies around how to get these seeds back to the people that have stewarded these seeds since time immemorial. I'm going to skip through here. You can see some of these infographics of places where seed bundles have gone. This was a seed drive that we ran in 2020, where we sent over 11,000 seed packets back to Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, and to return these seeds back home to Indigenous care. We've created a short film called Seed Mother Coming Home, which is available on NAFSA's YouTube. It's just a 7-minute love poem, I guess I would say, to this work, to just really talk about the importance of this revitalization of seeds. We've partnered with entities like the Cultural Conservancy and their Native Seed Pod to uplift the voices of this relational and seed rematriation work that we're doing. And, you know, this is part of seeds and it's part of land. So we have land back. You know, we have Deb Echohawk, who not only is preserving and upkeeping this bundle of traditional seeds from her Pawnee people. The Pawnee were displaced from their traditional homelands in Nebraska and moved down into Indian Territory during the time of the Trail of Tears over 150 years ago into Oklahoma. And when they came to Oklahoma, their seeds no longer grew in the same ways that they grew in their ancestral lands of Nebraska, because those seeds have been adapted to that specific bioregion for many, many, many generations. And so 20 years ago, Deb Echohawk partnered with Ronnie O'Brien, who's pictured, the white woman pictured here in this photo, and they began to bring those Pawnee seeds back to that ancestral homeland of Nebraska and to plant rematriation gardens along the North Platte in Nebraska. And now 20 years later, we have land being gifted back to the Pawnee people. We have thousands of pounds of traditional seeds being grown and returned back. And this is an effort of cultural reconciliation between descendants of settlers and descendants of the original indigenous peoples. And so this is resulting in land back. It's resulting in acres being donated back to the Pawnee Nation. And it's also showing you the possibility of that intercultural reconnection from something as horrific as the Trail of Tears, right, as the displacement of the Pawnee people. But then those, generations later, the descendants of those people, the ones who were forcefully removed, and the removers are coming together and under the shade tree of the garden, finding ways to find peace and finding ways to find reconciliation and reparations. We're seeing other communities follow suit. This, again, this is the ripple effect. We're seeing Nebraska farmer is returning land to the Ponca tribe along the Trail of Tears. So this is starting to become normalized. It's sort of that, it's just that the way in which this movement builds. And so part of reseeding a culture of belonging in our foodways and in a relational way is this intercultural collaboration, and that we need a diverse culture of agriculture moving towards that possibility of cultural sanity again. This is our rematriation garden in the Hudson Valley. You can see people of all different cultural communities coming together with the express purpose of returning Haudenosaunee seeds to Haudenosaunee land, and feeding indigenous peoples. And so it's just been a really beautiful act of healing. And what I say to this is that this work is relational. It's kin-centric, meaning it's centering our kin. It's healing generations of wrongdoing on Turtle Island, and that this work is intercultural work that we are engaged in. And it's critical. Like, we need every one of us to be around this table, truth telling to the things that aren't working for any of us, right? We have a culture of agriculture in this country, the industrial one, that is not working for any one of us, right? It's not creating that future that we want. So what are the ways in which we are leaning into our differences, right? Like I value diversity. What are the ways we're leaning into our differences and recognizing the value of diversity in building these relational seed systems? And so questions that I always like to sort of leave with you as we kind of bring this to a close and we move into the Q&A portion of our time together is thinking about, what does a journey of individual rematriation look like for you, each and every one of you here today, right? As part of this intercultural collective, what is that journey of reconnection to land, of reconnection to seed, of reconnection to food in meaningful ways? Right? And what does that mean for people who are settlers here, right? And so I just gave a few examples of ways in which people took their privilege and their different, their differences and leveraged that in ways that created really healing opportunities for relational agricultural projects. And what does it look like and feel like to cultivate a culture of belonging in your local food system? So as you engage in nourishing yourself and your family, what does it look like to cultivate that sense of belonging and that sense of care with the people around you? And what are the gifts that you bring to this work, right? So it's not just seed keepers and farmers. Like, we need poets and activists and artists and lawyers and public speakers and like all, mothers. And because, I always say this, I have the great good fortune of being a farmer and a seed keeper and a mother. And I get to teach seed keeping workshops and all kinds of things that I carry and the hats that I wear. But ultimately in my work, if I'm teaching a seed keeping workshop or if I'm coming here into the space today, the end game for me, the ultimate goal, is to continue to raise that next generation of people who love seeds as relatives and who see the earth as mother, right? Like, that's the big culture work that we're engaging in, right? And so we need the artists, we need all of the different people, and we need people who are continuing to, because change for me, like big change, big cultural change, isn't about like tugging and pulling on these behemoths of these metacultural, entities that are moving one way. It's doing that small relational work in small circles, creating these islands of coherence around you. If you begin to reconnect with an ancestral food or seed that is of meaning, or assisting indigenous peoples in their work to reconnect to their ancestral seeds through getting involved in these intercultural rematriation gardens that are popping up all over. What are the little ways that you can make shifts in the people around you, that for me, it's like, as I began to cultivate that bundle of seeds and get to know them and feel like, oh, these seeds connect me back to not only lineages of people behind me who came before me, but that I'm doing this on behalf of those yet to come. When you begin to approach the work like that, there's a glow that comes with that, right? There is a passion, there's a depth, right? And then as you begin to do that, like I have the good fortune of creating learning circles where people are reconnecting to seeds and food and land in meaningful ways, that becomes captivating to the people around you. And how are you sharing those stories so that they understand that if we want to create that more beautiful future of a landscape of nourishment that benefits us all, and that doesn't just mean us all as humans, but it's inclusive of the more than human kin that inhabit our earth, because when we scroll and look at the news feed, it's pretty doom and gloom, right? Like, we're looking at where that ship is taking us. It's not taking us in the right direction, but it's going to be a lot of small actions in cohesion with one another. And that's why I say a little island of coherence in your front yard or on your balcony or in your little life has the ability to make significant cultural change when we're doing it in mass. When many of us are starting to do this work, it begins to build that power. And so for me, I love memes. So of course I had to bring a meme into the space, which is, here's how it started for me. Little did I know, like 35, 40 years ago, that this would my whole life would be so seed centric, and that I would be, preaching the seed gospel here in spaces like this, where we, just wanting to get you all connected into this vision. But here's me, at 43, standing in my garden with an ancestral, this is a Buffalo Creek squash, which is a Haudenosaunee variety. This work has made my life infinitely more beautiful. You too can have living rooms that look like this. This is my living room. This is the harvest season when our seed relatives end up taking up all this space. This is I grew up, if you look at my little self, I didn't have anybody teaching me this. My parents didn't have the knowledge to teach me how to grow a garden, right? My grandparents did, and my great grandparents did, and they did what they could. But I wasn't raised in an environment where this was stewarded because of that intergenerational trauma. But in 1 or 2 generations, I changed the course of history and how things were going. And now I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old who have never not known the foods and seeds that fed their ancestors, right? They've always known the flavors of home, the flavors of our Haudenosaunee seed bundles. They grew up in spaces like this, crawling on top of big pumpkins and braiding corn and shelling corn. Like, that is everything in their being. It's written on their heart, right? And so in just 1 generation, 2 generations at most, we can make a cultural shift, and we can raise those children who see this holistic way of being and this way of knowing, right? And so this movement of rematriation is a deep intergenerational prayer that helps us move towards the future that we want for our children, with food and seed networks restoring this concentric commons of nourishment. And we often say in our communities, we carry our nations with the same love that we carry our children. And so I say we carry our nations with the same love that we carry our children, our seeds, our songs, our prayers, our original agreements. It is in our capacity to love fiercely, to defend what we feel most deeply connected to, that will bring about the revolution of the world we know in our hearts is possible. As we work to remember, to pull together the threads of memory and story, the wisdom of our ancestors, we were reminded again. Care for the seeds as though they are your children. Care for the earth, for she is your mother. Make yourself into a vessel into which the wise voices of your ancestors can echo. And as we say in our communities, we do not own the seeds or earth, but we borrow them from our children. So this picture was taken quite a few years ago, but this was my daughter. Maybe she's 8 or 9 in this picture. We're standing in a field of ancestral red corn, right? And so like this picture always brings emotion to my voice and tears to my eyes, because like my ancestors prayed for this, right? Like in those times, in those dark times, they prayed that like my daughter would know the seed songs and could crawl into the corn and experience that reverent curiosity that children have, right? And so this is the story of healing. It's a story of reconciliation, and it heals those wounds that my grandparents and my great grandparents and those who came before me had to go through. And so in honor of that grand lineage of seed keepers and land stewards and humans, again, who patted babies and heaved prayer at horizons and did so many things, that this work is about making renewed commitment to them, that they kept those seeds alive in the face of incredible atrocities, and that I am not going to be the generation who forgets the bundles and the ancestral brilliance that they gave to us, and that I make my life a love poem to that work, and that I continue to bring you all along with me to see what are the ways in which you can continue to make renewed commitment in this time, that it's not too late, right? Sometimes we look at the news and the news feeds and all of that, and we think humans have really screwed things up, and that we're moving in this direction of, having landscapes of nourishment that are inherently destructive and enslave not only humans, but enslave seeds and enslave animals and enslave the land herself, right? But it's not too late. It's not too late to cultivate a culture of care and a culture of belonging into our food systems. But it's time for us to wake up, and it's time for us to reconnect and make that renewed commitment for those yet to come. So I just want to thank you all, and then maybe we can open it up for Q&A. And this is how you can stay in touch with me. I love connecting in all kinds of meaningful ways with all of you in Circle. So great. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share.
Excellent. Thank you, Rowan. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or you can put them into the chat and we'd be happy to read them off for you. Nicole?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Rowan. I messaged a friend during the middle of your talk and said, I don't know the last time I felt this grounded and regulated and hopeful all at once, which is itself just such a tremendous gift. And I've been following your work for some time and been really inspired by it. And I guess a question I'm left holding here as someone who descends from settlers, though from later immigrants who were also sort of forced to give up their culture and their language, and has been working in food system spaces and on a journey to try to kind of untangle and find my way back to some of those missing cultural memories. I'm wondering, as we do that, people like me, similarly situated, do that work, what are some of the best ways in which we can show up and support the work that you're doing? Recognizing that we're on sort of parallel journeys of having to heal intergenerational trauma of a different variety, but also, and maybe not wanting to wait for some kind of imagined sense and state of perfect wholeness to show up in those supportive exchanges. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to share some of what that feels like from the other side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Thank you, Nicole, for uplifting that. And it's something, again, I think part of this work is like extending ourselves an immense amount of grace in this work to continue to remember that we're all that's why I kind of start out the presentation talking about diaspora and talk about like that we're all untouched by this grief, because I think when we start to come in, like for me as an Indigenous woman, I had to do a lot of work in like from a somatic place and from like a trauma informed place to even be able to get to the place where I could see that descendants of settlers or perhaps immigrants or who impacted that land loss from my community we're also wounded people too, right? Like, and so there's like, that work is so just continuing to practice that empathy. Like for me, for my own personal self, it was just like continuing to work with different modalities of extending empathy for the way in which, so some of that for me, like this is kind of going to be a roundabout way of answering a question, but like some of that for me was about like learning history and like learning history about like what even promoted people to move to this continent, and all of the different waves in history. But what I found, because people like yourself who have an interest who are doing this work yourself, and who have an interest of aligning their work with the work that we're doing, because you can see in our rematriation gardens, there were people like you who were like, I'm genuinely interested in not doing this work on behalf of anybody, but doing this work alongside, right? Like we're doing this work alongside each other, right? Because there's these like paths, this parallel paths that we're all walking on, that this work helps to heal, right? And what we often think, perhaps naively, and I admit this myself, is that we want, when we start to come together with this idea of growing the seed rematriation garden or growing, doing this work alongside each other, is that we want to imagine that the arc of trust in this work like starts here where we're at, and just is like this smooth arc and curve upwards as we build relationality and work together. And what I will say is that it's not that way. Like it's like the arc of trust is like it's going up, but it's like this, because we're human, and like as we do this work, all of us get triggered in our own senses of like insecurities and feeling like those historical harms coming into the space, and feel, so ultimately when allies come to me and say like, how can we support this work, and how can we do this work alongside one another, a lot of it is doing that work of acknowledging the ways in which all of us have been impacted, and doing that deep dive into how racialized trauma has impacted all of us in our own bodies. So I always recommend, looking to the work of Resmaa Menakem and like my grandmother's hands, and the work of white bodies and bodies of culture and Black bodies are acknowledging the ways in which racialized trauma has impacted all of us, and how that impacts the way that we show up in spaces, right? With whether it's white bodies showing up with like guilt, or feeling, the insecurities of not belonging, or feeling like not knowing, how to show up in reciprocal right relationship with people who perhaps their ancestors had harmed. There's like so many layers of complexity there, but like doing that nervous system regulating work. And I think you all, I'm probably preaching the choir here, because we're all doing that work here of really learning how to regulate our nervous systems inside of systems of complexity, where we're also we're looking at it from a social justice and equity lens, where we're not just transcending the shit, but we're like metabolizing it and composting it and doing this work. And so I think just continuing to do it slowly. One tome or book that has helped me out a lot in trying to understand how to talk about how to do this work, from like, because I get this question a lot. I get this question a lot about like, how can non-native people work in these settings? And Tyson Yunkaporta wrote this book called Sand Talk. And this book, I don't know if you all have read it, but it's an incredible book. And it talks about how indigenous cosmovisions can help, heal the world. It's got a title that's sort of probably like catchy like that. But he talks about in that book of his understanding of his elders, of how a lot of the times when non-Aboriginal or non-native people want to come in and help, they often come in with like a savior complex, right? Like this, like animated by their guilt or their shame or like whatever it is, like they come in from this sort of like savioristic way. And that often leads to a very inverted backwards way of approaching change making. And it often comes from a place of then them coming in with like, well, we can solve the problem, like from the very Peace Corps type way, where it's like, we're going to come in here and have we know all the answers to the problems that we created, and like do that. And what Tyson and his elders, Mama Doris is somebody who he talks about in that book, talk about the most important part and of the first step of that process is respect, is actually just building relationships and being in a respectful relationship with one another. So like the rematriation garden that happened in the Hudson Valley started because I was in relationship for years with Ken Green, who was founder of Hudson Valley Seed Library. And like we had built a relationship of trust over years in a very low stakes way, right? In a very like, we're going to learn from one another and we're going to try and get to know each other. And like, I was like flea checking him a little, like just that kind of like low stakes way, building this relationship. And then he had a constellation of relationships where eventually there was land at Hudson Valley Farm Hub and he knew those people there. And then that opened up a doorway for more relationships to build, right? And so it was beginning from that place of just slow relationality and building relationships. Then you can drop into some of that like action as opposed to just jumping into the action and then kind of, so it's just really, there's no quick and dirty way to say that. It's just that like build relationship with the people around you in slow and low stakes ways. And then eventually you can build up to these projects that have these greater impact. Hopefully that helps, Nicole. I know it's a big question. And thanks, Miles, for dropping in Sand Talk. We did a book club with that in my Patreon. So. Yeah.
And then another question that came in from Jose is, do you know of any initiatives on Vancouver Island?
I don't. Well, I will say that there's like the BC Seed Co-op. It's an eco co-op that's in the Vancouver region that's not Native led, but I know that they are working in building relationships with Indigenous communities. So it's an intercultural initiative. It's like the BC Seed Co-op, I think it's called. So you might be able to contact folks there and then see if like what sort of headway that they've made in some of that relational work. Yeah, there you go. Great. Any other questions or any comments? How did things land? What is coming up for you? Those questions that I posed around what is this, what does meaningful rematriation to this work look like? Feel free. We have about 10 more minutes. So if anybody has anything else they want to add to the circle.
Rowan, I have a question.
Yep.
Maybe a question reflection. I think there's some folks here. We've been on this in the summit together for the week and some new faces. And there's been I don't know who spoke to it, but there's like a piece of learning for sure. I'm a cis white woman, but there's a piece about what's happening for me through this week, most especially with the Indigenous facilitators of remembering.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like, and so I'm like in this tension and just feeling into that of like, there's a learning curve, right, around agriculture and regenerative agriculture. And, just like but there's like a piece that's like, I know this. And so I'm curious if you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. And that's why I always use the word rehydration, because I feel like that's what it is. And that's what it felt like for me, right? Like you have these seeds of remembrance. They're in the earth of our body. They're in there, they're like, you have grandmas, you have great grandmas, you have, uncles and grandfathers somewhere in your lineage that knew how to do this, right? Like I often think about, like, for instance, I'll just give a little anecdote. So like we have an educational seed farm here. Pre-COVID, we did a lot of like seed workshops. We're just reintegrating back into doing that. And a lot of our work is very hands-on. It's like very sensory, it's like there's so much sensory. There's, we're threshing herbs and getting their seeds out and, tobacco pods and doing all this stuff. And I remember having a group of young folks and we were taking tobacco pods and they're these beautiful little pods. They're kind of look like little pillows and we're crunching them. They're crunching them up. And it was like so satisfying. Like there was such the satisfying sense that everybody was speaking to. And this young kid said, this is kind of like popping bubble wrap, like how we have that, like that desire to like pop thing, like pop bubble wrap. And then, so we got into this conversation about like, what if like flipping the script or like reframing things, what if our desire to like pop things like that in this like where we don't have connections to seed, like harkens back to our desire of having those like sensory experiences of threshing seed and crushing up seed that's like kind of missing in our cultural landscape. And so we find that sensory appreciation in other ways, like popping bubble wrap, right? And so again, in those settings, when people are threshing seeds, or we go to farmers market and set up places where there's seeds there, or we getting people to plant gardens with us again, there is a very palpable remembrance that happens. Like you see, again, a sparkle, oh, I know this, I'm remembering, I'm rehydrating this. What I will also say to this, and this was something that I've been processing for 20 plus years, and I have had to increase my skill set as a facilitator and a teacher in holding space for this, is that oftentimes when we begin to remember and put things back together, up under that is a huge wellspring of grief that comes, because a lot of the times we don't even realize that we're missing something, but we're missing something, right? We're missing that connection, that sensory connection, or that real visceral or palpable connection to food and seed. And I felt that way. I was like on a dusty farmhouse floor in New England, like, rifling through these seed packets of heirloom tomatoes, and like learning about how, this variety descended from somebody who came from Italy, and they had like sewn the seed into their best coat pocket and gone across the Atlantic and ended up in Ellis Island. And this tomato seed reminded them of their grandmother's cooking at home, and that's why they brought it with them. And I remember being like, oh, well, what are the foods and seeds that fed my ancestors? Like, my mom doesn't cook seeds that remind her of home, because there was a lot of trauma there was a lot of that. And so what unearthed for me was like, oh, that's something I'm missing, and I never even realized I was missing it until I encountered that. And then it was like a wellspring of grief and anger and rage around why was that birthright taken from me and all of this stuff. But then I transformed those emotions into action, right? And I transformed those emotions into my curiosity and my excitement to move in that direction. So I just say this as like sort of not for warning, but just sort of to set that landscape that says that when we start to engage in this work and start to remember, there's going to be amazing epiphanies. Like for me, I had these amazing epiphanies and excitement and thrill and joy and pleasure and, all of that sensory remembering. But with it will also come kind of the shadowy side of some of those feelings of like, well, why was my family disconnected from these foods and seeds, and that longing or that deeper, so just being kind to yourself in this work, and being kind to ourselves as we do this in collective to be trauma informed. Like we'll have a seed keeping workshop and be doing this work, and then next thing you know, somebody's having like crying and having, just this deep, profound connection to seed that is bringing up a lot of emotion for them. And so just be kind to yourself as you all move along this path, to recognizing that those relationships that got severed somewhere along the line, when you start to remember and reconnect, it's tender work, it's vulnerable work. And but we have so many tools in this day and age to be able to handle that, and it's worth some of those feelings of discomfort. So any other thoughts or questions? I know we just have a couple more minutes, but it's been such a pleasure to be with you all. Oh, Valati, maybe?
Yep. I gotcha.
I'm sorry, I forgot to change my name there. My name is Nancy, and I'm from upstate New York in the Capital Region. And I've been working a lot, like I've named myself a climate activist, and it sometimes gets so overwhelming. And your message just gave me hope about starting in small steps, making people aware. And that's pretty much what I do. I'm not a scientist and I don't have all the facts in front of me, but I do know how to connect with people and to talk about it. And I remember, I think it was Dr. Catherine Hayhoe who said the most important thing you can do about the climate is talk about it. And you talking about your connection with the earth. I've gotten into native planting. It was just so wonderful for me. I am, from the Western European connection there. And I feel like I've generations past that I have no connection there. But that's okay. And I can still work on where my connections are, but you've just given me a lot of hope. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, it's just to reiterate what you just said there, Nancy, is that it's just these small little steps, right? It's like all the little ways we start to remember. And just back to what Jess had said about the word remembering, remember is to put things back together again, like in little pieces, right? So finding the little ways in which you can kind of bring some of that sanity back in, right? And in closing, perhaps I could just say, it's a real privilege to be able to do this work and to be able to carry these seeds and carry this bundle. And like you all will find as you know, recognize that we all have a seed bundle that we need to add things to and steward it well, is that my elders say with privilege comes responsibility, right? And I always like to take words apart. So responsibility is the ability to respond. So what do you have the ability to respond to in this moment, right? What in this work do you have the ability to respond to? Where can you show up for seeds and that relationship with seeds in just a small, meaningful way that, again, works at a collective level to change the frequency and resonance of what's possible in the future. So I really thank you all for listening and coming with your whole hearts. And perhaps you just walk away from our time together thinking about what is one way that you can make renewed commitment to a more relational landscape of nourishment in your little neck of the woods and your little island of coherence. So I appreciate you all.
Thank you so much, Rowan. And thank you all for joining us today. So we'll see you this evening, and we hope that you had a wonderful time and enjoy the recording as well. That'll be up in the next 24 hours. And tonight we will see you for Black Earth Wisdom with Leah Penniman. Be well and have a wonderful afternoon.